It was the busiest Friday afternoon the restaurant had seen all month. Luxury cars filled the parking lot. Business executives, politicians, and celebrities occupied nearly every table. The restaurant's reputation had been built on one promise: perfection. And no one demanded perfection more than its new owner, 32-year-old CEO Daniel Carter. Brilliant, wealthy, ruthless. He had recently bought the famous family restaurant chain after his father's retirement. Since taking over, he had fired 12 employees. "If you can't meet my standards, you don't belong here." That was his favorite sentence. Employees whispered it every time he walked through the dining room, because everyone feared him, especially one woman, Margaret Wilson, 68 years old, a waitress who had worked in that restaurant for 43 years. She wasn't fast anymore. Her hands trembled slightly whenever she carried heavy trays. But every regular customer knew her name. She remembered birthdays, favorite meals, anniversaries. She treated every guest like family. Still, Daniel saw something different. He saw an old employee who no longer fit his modern vision. That afternoon, Margaret accidentally placed tomato soup on the wrong table. It was a simple mistake. She apologized immediately. The customer smiled. "It's all right." But Daniel had seen everything. He stormed across the restaurant. His expensive shoes echoed against the marble floor. Every conversation stopped. Every employee froze. Daniel stood directly in front of Margaret. His voice was cold enough to silence the entire room. "How many times have I warned you?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. It won't happen again." Daniel wasn't finished. "No, it already happened. You've embarrassed this restaurant." The dining room became painfully quiet. Customers watched without saying a word. Margaret's hands shook harder. She clutched the serving tray tightly. Daniel pointed toward the kitchen. "Go take off your apron. You're finished." Gasps filled the restaurant. 43 years. Gone in less than 30 seconds. Margaret slowly nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She quietly untied her old blue apron. Then, before placing it on the counter, she reached into its pocket and pulled out a faded black and white photograph. She looked at it for several seconds, then whispered softly, "I hope you'd never make me show you this." Daniel frowned. "What picture?" Margaret slowly looked into his eyes. "It belonged to your father. And after today, it belongs to you." Daniel laughed. But 30 seconds later, that single photograph would change everything. Hook. When Daniel finally looked at the old photograph, his face turned completely white. The entire restaurant fell silent. Even the kitchen staff stopped moving. Every eye was fixed on the faded photograph in Margaret's hands. Daniel crossed his arms. "You're wasting everyone's time. If that's supposed to make me change my mind, it won't." Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gently placed the photograph on the nearest table. "Take a closer look." Daniel sighed impatiently, but something about her calm voice made him stop. He picked up the photograph. At first, it looked ordinary. A young couple standing outside a tiny roadside diner. Between them, a smiling little boy. Then Daniel noticed something strange. The man in the picture looked familiar. Very familiar. His heart skipped a beat. It was his father, nearly 40 years younger, standing beside Margaret. Daniel frowned. "Where did you get this?" Margaret smiled sadly. "I didn't get it. I was there." Daniel stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Margaret took a slow breath. 43 years ago, your father didn't own restaurants. He barely owned a broken pickup truck. He was struggling to keep a tiny diner alive. The bank was about to take everything. Daniel had never heard this story before. His father always claimed he had built the business alone. Margaret continued, "I worked 16-hour shifts, sometimes without getting paid, because your father couldn't afford wages. He promised, 'One day, if this place survives, I'll never forget you.'" Daniel looked down at the photograph again. On the back, there was handwriting, old, faded, but still readable. It said, "To Margaret, the woman who saved my dream. I owe you more than I can ever repay. William Carter." Daniel slowly turned the photo over again. His confident expression disappeared. His father's signature was unmistakable. For the first time that day, Daniel had nothing to say. Margaret quietly picked up her apron. "I never wanted special treatment. I only wanted to finish my last year with dignity. I made one mistake today, but I gave this company 43 years of my life. No one in the restaurant moved. Several customers lowered their eyes. One young waitress quietly wiped away a tear. Daniel looked around the room. For the first time, he realized every employee was watching him, not as a CEO, but as a man, and they were waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. Hook. Just as Daniel tried to speak, the restaurant's front door opened, and the person walking in would reveal a secret his own father had hidden for decades. Every head in the restaurant turned toward the entrance. An elderly man wearing a dark gray suit slowly walked inside. His silver hair was neatly combed. His posture was straight. The moment he entered, every employee recognized him. William Carter, the founder of Carter's Restaurants, Daniel's father. Although he had retired nearly 2 years earlier, everyone still respected him. William looked around the dining room, then noticed Margaret standing there, still holding her apron. His smile disappeared. He looked at Daniel. What happened? Daniel cleared his throat. I fired her. William's face turned pale. You what? Daniel spoke confidently. She made another mistake. I can't let emotions destroy company standards. William slowly looked toward Margaret, then back at his son. How long has she worked here? Daniel answered. 43 years. William nodded quietly. And in 43 years, how many mistakes has she made? Daniel hesitated. I don't know. William took another step forward. I do. He turned toward everyone in the restaurant. I know exactly how many. The room became completely silent. William smiled softly. 2. People looked at each other in confusion. Daniel frowned. Only 2. William nodded. The first mistake happened 43 years ago. Everyone listened carefully. It was my first week as a restaurant owner. I had no money, no experience. I was overwhelmed. A customer ordered coffee. Margaret accidentally dropped the entire tray. I thought everything was over. I believed that one mistake would ruin my business. William looked directly at Margaret, but she stayed after closing. She cleaned the restaurant. Then she looked at me and said, tomorrow we'll do better. William's eyes became moist. And she was right. He paused for a moment. The second mistake was the bowl of soup she served to the wrong table today. He turned toward Daniel. So in 43 years, she made 2 honest mistakes. Then William asked quietly, how many mistakes have you made since becoming CEO? Daniel didn't answer. William continued, you've fired 12 people. You've lost 6 experienced employees. You've cut everyone's bonuses. And customer satisfaction has dropped 9%. Daniel's confidence slowly faded. He had never heard his father speak to him like this. William stepped closer. You think leadership is about demanding perfection. It isn't. It's about earning loyalty. He pointed toward Margaret. She helped build this company. You inherited it. Those words hit Daniel harder than anything he had ever heard. For the first time, he looked at Margaret, not as an elderly waitress, but as someone who had sacrificed nearly half her life to protect his father's dream. Hook. Then William said something that Daniel never expected to hear. There's one truth about Margaret that I've hidden from you your entire life. Daniel stared at his father. What truth? William looked toward Margaret, as if asking for permission. Margaret gave a small nod. It's time. William took a slow breath. 28 years ago, your mother became seriously ill. Daniel's expression changed. He had been told that part of the story many times. His mother had spent months in the hospital before passing away. But what came next? He had never heard. The hospital bills were impossible. I had already borrowed money from every bank that would listen. I was preparing to sell the restaurant. Daniel whispered, you never told me that. William shook his head. Because I was ashamed. He looked at Margaret. The night before I signed the papers, Margaret came to my house. She placed a small wooden box on my kitchen table. Daniel frowned. What was inside? Margaret answered quietly. My savings. I had been saving for nearly 15 years. I wanted to buy a little house after retirement. William's voice began to crack. There was almost $80,000 inside. Daniel's eyes widened. 80,000? Margaret smiled gently. It wasn't enough to save your mother, but it was enough to save the restaurant. William nodded. If she hadn't given me that money, the bank would have taken everything. There would never have been a Carter restaurant. There would never have been a CEO. There would never have been your fortune. Daniel slowly looked around the restaurant. The walls, the expensive furniture. The business he had always believed was built by his father's determination alone existed because of the woman standing quietly in front of him. He looked back at Margaret. Why? Why didn't you ever tell me? Margaret's answer came without hesitation. Because kindness isn't a business investment. You don't do it so people owe you. You do it because someone needs help. Silence filled the restaurant. Several customers quietly wiped tears from their eyes. One elderly couple reached across the table and held hands. Daniel looked down at the photograph again, then at the old apron in Margaret's hands. For the first time in his life, he felt ashamed, not because he had fired an employee, but because he had judged someone's value without knowing their story. Slowly, he walked toward Margaret. Every employee watched. Every customer waited. Daniel stopped just inches away from her. Then, to everyone's complete shock, the young CEO lowered his head and said 5 words, words no one had ever imagined hearing from him. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Hook. Margaret looked into Daniel's eyes, then gave him an answer. That changed the future of the entire company forever. The restaurant remained completely silent. Dozens of customers, nearly 50 employees. Everyone waited for Margaret's answer. She looked at Daniel for several long seconds. Then, she smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone who had won. It was the smile of someone who had finally been understood. I forgave you the moment you said you were sorry. Daniel slowly exhaled. He hadn't even realized he had been holding his breath. But forgiveness, Margaret continued, doesn't erase a lesson. Daniel nodded. I know. She looked around the restaurant. Do you know why people stayed here for so many years? Daniel shook his head. It wasn't because the food was perfect. It wasn't because the building was beautiful. It was because your father built this place with heart. He knew every employee's name. He attended their weddings. He visited them in hospitals. When someone's child was born, he was the first to send flowers. Margaret paused, but after he retired, the restaurant became a business. It stopped feeling like a family. Daniel looked around. For the first time, he noticed something he had ignored for months. Nobody looked happy. The chefs looked exhausted. The servers looked anxious. Even the managers avoided eye contact. Everyone was working, but no one was smiling. Daniel whispered, I thought fear created discipline. Margaret gently shook her head. Fear creates silence. Respect creates loyalty. Those words stayed with Daniel. He suddenly remembered something his father used to say when he was a child. If people are afraid of you, they'll work for your paycheck. But if they respect you, they'll protect your dream. Daniel couldn't believe he had forgotten those words. He slowly turned toward the employees. I owe every one of you an apology. No one spoke. I spent months trying to build a stronger company, but I almost destroyed the people who built it. He looked directly at Walter, the elderly dishwasher, then at the young waitresses, the cooks, the cleaners, the cashiers, every face in the room. Starting today, no employee will ever be humiliated in front of others again. If someone makes a mistake, we'll teach. We won't shame. The room remained quiet. Then, a single person started clapping. It was William. A second later, one waiter joined him, then another. Within moments, the entire restaurant erupted into applause. Some employees smiled through tears. Others hugged one another. Margaret quietly wiped her eyes. Daniel walked back toward her. I fired you today. I'd like to correct that mistake. Margaret laughed softly. I'm 70 years old, Daniel. I don't need my job back. Daniel looked confused. Then what do you want? Margaret smiled. I want something much more important. Hook. Margaret's final request wasn't about money or promotion. It was something that would completely change the future of Carter restaurants forever. Daniel looked at Margaret. What is it? If there's anything I can do, I'll do it. Margaret smiled warmly. There is, but it isn't for me. She slowly turned toward the employees gathered around the restaurant. Promise me that no employee in this company will ever feel invisible again. Daniel remained silent. Margaret continued, I don't need another paycheck. I don't need another promotion. I've had a beautiful career. But there are people here who go home every night believing they don't matter. She pointed toward the kitchen. The dishwasher, the cleaners, the cooks, the servers. They're not just employees. They're the reason customers come back. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He slowly nodded. I promise. No one in this company will ever be treated as less than human again. Margaret smiled. Then my job here is finally finished. She gently folded her apron, placed it on the table, and walked toward the exit. Halfway there, Daniel called out, Margaret. She turned around. I still haven't thanked you. She smiled. You already did, when you chose kindness over pride. Then she quietly walked out of the restaurant. No dramatic music, no grand speech, just quiet dignity. 3 months later, everything had changed. The restaurant introduced a new tradition. Every new manager, including Daniel, had to spend 1 full week working every position in the restaurant. Cleaning tables, washing dishes, serving customers, sweeping floors. Because Daniel believed, you can never lead people you refuse to understand. Employee turnover dropped by nearly 60%. Customer satisfaction reached its highest level in over 10 years. For the first time, employees smiled because they wanted to, not because they had to. One afternoon, Daniel drove to a small white house on the edge of town. He knocked on the door. Margaret opened it with a surprised smile. What are you doing here? Daniel held out a small wooden frame. Inside was the old black and white photograph. But beneath it, a new plaque had been added. It read, The woman who saved our dream. Daniel looked at her and quietly said, This belongs to the person who truly built Carter Restaurants. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She hugged him like a son. Daniel smiled. My father left me a company. You taught me how to deserve it. As Daniel walked back to his car, he looked one last time at Margaret standing on her porch. He finally understood something that no business school had ever taught him. A great company isn't built by the person whose name is on the building. It's built by the people whose names no one remembers.